Dave, what was the feeling in the WWF about Lawrence Taylor's ability to actually pull the match off in the main event?
I don't know that was actually, I mean, that was like the thing they prayed for, but I think that the idea is that they were, I mean, business was down and they were looking for the celebrity to be the new Mr. T, someone who was going to get them that media publicity that they hadn't gotten at some of the other WrestleManias when they had stopped using celebrities, and would get them the casual talk on the street that they had when they had Mr. T. So they took, Lawrence Taylor, who was a legendary football player from New York, their most populous market, and hoped that he would do that. I guess kind of like the Fridge did. Of course, the Fridge was active at the time, and LT was, I think he had just ended his career, and but I mean. And they wanted to do the whole thing, I mean, they obviously they had several NFL players. I think even Steve McMichael was involved in that one before he went to WCW. Mm-hmm. And I think was Ken Norton. I think it was Ken Norton Jr. was involved, but there were several players that were going to be like LT's football players. So it would be that whole NFL theme that they did in '85 or '86, and trying to recreate it in '95.
Wow. And Dave, along those same lines, why was Bam Bam Bigelow selected as the guy to face LT?
That's a really interesting thing. I think the feeling was they were looking for a guy who would visually appeal to the non-wrestling fan, and they took this guy. And the whole idea that they were trying to sell is, okay, wrestling may be worked, but we've got this badass, tattooed up, 300-plus pound guy who really doesn't like LT. I mean, the whole thing in the build-up that Bigelow was doing, which I don't know that you would do today, is almost going in there with the idea that, okay, you may think you know what wrestling is, but I really don't like LT, and this isn't going to be what you think it is. And when we're in there, nobody can stop me, type of a thing. So they got a guy who looked big, mean, and ugly, and could play that role, and I think that, and also could lose to LT, mm-hmm. and he wasn't the top guy, so it would work from a WWE standpoint in the sense that they weren't sacrificing, Shawn Michaels, their world champion, or Kevin Nash, who was, right. Somebody along those lines. So I think that was the idea of Bigelow was the look and everything.
Were people in the WWF locker room sort of mad or rankled that Lawrence Taylor got the main event spotlight on this show of all the guys working so hard year round?
Not like you hear now. I think that there probably was some, but it was a different era. They were young enough to remember that Mr. T, pretty much, and Cyndi Lauper put WWF on the map. They weren't so far removed as like the generation now that really doesn't understand the idea of celebrities at WrestleMania or guest appearances at WrestleMania, and has that thing of WrestleMania is always going to be a success. Then WrestleMania wasn't a guaranteed success. I mean, this WrestleMania, was no great shakes, and by '97 WrestleMania was the, I think 6th biggest pay-per-view or 7th biggest pay-per-view of the year that year. So it wasn't, from I would say from probably from 90 on, 91ish, WrestleMania wasn't that big anymore. I mean, it was really huge the first couple of years, and it got really huge again in the 2000s, where it became this annual celebration. And even when the business wasn't bad, WrestleMania went through the roof. But in this period, WrestleMania reflected the business. The business wasn't that strong, and the all of these guys on this card grew up with WrestleMania 1 and 2, and understood that that's part of the trying to get WrestleMania back to where it was, because it wasn't there then. So, no, I really didn't hear hardly. I mean, I hear a little bit? Yes, but it was very little. It was nothing like when they brought Dwayne Johnson back, and, you would hear a lot of guys complaining, and I was thinking like, okay, now we got a whole generation of guys who don't understand business anymore.
Right.
It was pretty strange.
A couple of years after this, Bam Bam Bigelow would float over to ECW, and when he went there, crowds everywhere would chant LT at him as sort of like a mocking thing that he had done the job for LT at WrestleMania. Do you think this match at WrestleMania 11 really came to define Bam Bam Bigelow's career in any way?
It was probably his highest spotlight thing. I mean, the funny part of the whole thing is that the idea to get him to do it, and he did a good job with it, was that you're going to come out of this with so much visibility. Yeah, you're going to lose, but you're going to immediately be turned babyface, so that loss isn't going to matter. And as a babyface, we're going to, the idea was to bring LT back at SummerSlam or even next year's WrestleMania and have LT and Bam Bam as a tag team against some other heels to get those heels over, and for Bam Bam to be a top babyface, and even like the top babyface, and that's where the dynamic got weird, because you had Shawn Michaels and you had Kevin Nash there, and they, it's hard to say, Bam Bam blamed them. A lot of people blamed them. At the time it was going on, I kind of was blaming them, but I mean, there's always two sides to the story of why the Bam Bam Bigelow babyface turn, which did happen, didn't take off and ended up being pretty much the beginning of the end of his WWE run, as opposed to what he was sold on, which is that now you're finally going to, because when Bigelow first came into wrestling, the idea, everybody thought Bigelow was going to be this great thing because he was this 380-pound guy who could drop kick and he had that great look and everything, and he became such a big star in Japan. And I think the feeling was that WWF is a big man's territory, all these things. Bigelow was going to make it, and he never really did. He was always kind of he was always kind of a disappointment in the United States. In WCW, he didn't make it quite as big. And this was it, like, okay, you've got your experience, you're still agile, and this is going to be, you're finally going to get to be what we all thought you would be, and it didn't happen this time either.
It's interesting that you mentioned that too, because I realized that Bam Bam never got a title run during his last couple of years, from 92 to 95, when he was in the WWE, and I always thought that was curious.
They were still protecting the championship, in the sense there's only a few guys who held the title during those years, and Bam Bam was never over anywhere near that level. I mean, this was supposed to project him there, but even then, I don't know that he was a guy that they would make world champion. I mean, they had, I think they wanted a regular wrestler to be world champion, but he could be that monster babyface who would team with the world champion when the world champion, if you had a babyface world champion who needed a big crazy partner. And I think maybe that's where, maybe a Nash or somebody like that goes, that may be my role if Shawn's going to be the champion. So, let's make sure he doesn't get over. But, and again, I don't want to say it's all Nash, because it's Vince's decision. I can only say that Bam Bam blamed Nash and Shawn.
Yeah. On a different note, we just covered WrestleMania 10 on the Laps Fan, and I was curious, what happened between WrestleManias 10 and 11 that completely deflated Lex Luger?
I mean, I think Lex Luger was deflated when he didn't win the title at SummerSlam in 93?
93, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that from that point on, he was deflated. I think if he had won the title at SummerSlam, it was all primed and ready. I can't say he would have been a big success. I don't think he would have been the success that Vince had hoped for anyway, because he never was. I mean, he was one of those guys who was close but never quite had whatever it was. I think he was too much like Hogan was part of the thing, and he didn't have Hogan's charisma. But if they had pulled the trigger at the right time, I would have had a fighting chance, and he did have momentum. It wasn't as much momentum as I thought, but when it didn't happen, it was kind of like, well, he failed. I mean, and the idea was that we're going to save it for Mania. By the time they got to Mania, people had pretty much gotten off the Lex Luger bandwagon, and it became the Bret Hart bandwagon, and we want to support Bret Hart against the hand-picked Lex Luger. So by that point, I think Lex's fate had already been sealed by WrestleMania in the year before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Dave, with the top spot sort of up for grabs at this point in time, they went with Kevin Nash, and he beat Bob Backlund for the championship November of 94. Here he is at WrestleMania 11 against Shawn Michaels in what you could consider in some ways the co-main event, though certainly Lawrence Taylor and Bam Bam Bigelow occupied the large bulk of the spotlight. The WWF did try to position Kevin Nash next to Lawrence Taylor in public appearances and such to establish, much like Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, that this is our guy now. This is our face of the company.
Look how big he is.
Right.
Because you got big bad Lawrence Taylor, who everybody knew, and you got, Kevin Nash, who just towered over him. And the big appeal of Kevin Nash was that he was 6'10", 6'9", whatever he really was.
Yeah, he had that height, and I mean,
And he had a really cool look, and he had a good physique. You know, he had part of the package, but he didn't have it again. You know, I mean, when you know, he wasn't the success Vince hoped for him to be either, or else he would have had the run that some of the other guys had.
And also, Jack and you guys briefly mentioned Nash's win over Backlund, and I was curious: was there ever a plan to go with Backlund, or was he always a 2-3 day transitional champion for Nash to just clobber?
Backlund was when everything fell apart with Warrior and with Davey Boy Smith. They had a list of guys, you know, that they were going to go with, and Bob Backlund was on the list, and they went with Bret Hart, but he was under consideration. When he was brought back, the idea was that he would eventually, you know, the story, if you remember how he got brought back, it's like, 45 years old or whatever it was, 44 years old. I mean, they gave his real age, and it was like this guy making his big comeback, and the plan was for him to get the championship. You know, I don't know that it was ever going to be a long run because Vince is into younger guys, so it would probably have been a short run under any circumstances. But the 3 days, no. You know, I mean, that 3 days was, you know, I think to have Nash win the championship in you know, whatever it was, 9 seconds or whatever, in this incredibly dominant way, but not have him do it over Bret Hart, because you could always do business with Nash and Bret Hart. But if, you know, once Nash beat Bob Backlund in 9 seconds, I mean, Bob was done as a headliner from that point on, and they didn't want to kill Bret as a headliner. So you had, you know, Bob just became the transition guy, like a Stan Stasiak and like an Ivan Koloff.
Right. You mentioned doing business, Dave. 1995 is, of course, infamous for being kind of the softest business year post the 1984, post Vince Jr. taking the reins that WWF ever had. Talk about 1995, the WWF's business, and why attendance was so low and all the metrics were so down.
Well, I think it started really in 92. You know, when Hogan, and you know, Hogan was gone. They built so much around Hogan. Nash wasn't the guy. WCW really hadn't. You know, WCW was doing terrible until the end of the year. Once Nitro started, WCW started to turn around, and they turned around a little bit with Hogan. But I don't think that the WCW was any part of the reason why WWF was struggled those years. I mean, it was part of the struggle. They were trying to get over new talent. Wrestling itself, everybody in wrestling was dying in 1995. I mean, WWF and WCW.